The Eclipse P500A from Fantex is a premium mid-tower that combines airflow performance and aesthetics. A full mesh front and a ridiculous amount of fan and radiator configurations with up to 7 120mm fans ensure that your components never thermal throttle. The Eclipse P500A is available in both RGB and non-RGB versions, making it a flexible choice for your next system builder upgrade. To see the full list of specs and configurations, click the sponsored link in the description below. Okay, first things first, my eyes are bloodshot, my brain is frazzled. I've been benchmarking for 2 straight days, over 18 hours of benchmarks because I want to get these numbers right for you guys, and I compared them with various cards. I'm gonna misspeak, I'm gonna do stupid things. That's a normal video. All right, 3080, it's here. We unboxed it already. We're not gonna talk about things I've already talked about in the unboxing. In fact, I'm gonna be that YouTuber that's like, go watch our previous video where we already talked about the connector and stuff. So you guys can go and watch that video if you want to.
Right over here.
It'll pop out there unless I forget. There we go. We already talked about the cooler, the way it potentially comes apart. There's no screws on it. The 12-pin plug, we talked about aftermarket plugs to replace this guy so it's not all ugly. It's all over there. I want to get right to the performance videos today. There's a lot to talk about. So about testing methodology here, and a couple of things about the card as well. A lot of people were disappointed in that last video that we didn't power it up, we didn't show you any metrics or anything, and that's just unfortunately the way the embargoes worked. But let's start with this. You know when Jensen said, and it lights up?
The RTX 3080, and it lights up.
I think there was a collective, duh. They've like all lit up? They've all lit up for like years and years now. Well, my biggest complaint with this guy, and I loved this cooler, and this is still one of their favorite cooler designs for me, their first double fan cooler, is that when you turn it this way, the big GeForce logo lights up green. And I get that that's NVIDIA's color, green. That doesn't work with all the builds. The Titan RTX had a white LED, and I'll be damned if this one didn't have a white LED in it too. So not only does the GeForce logo on this and the GeForce RTX on the side light up white, the front and the back of the card inside the heatsink also, why do I keep taking this off? I want to let it stand up there and be all ugly so people know not to use it. Anyway, the actual bottom side of the car, the X, lights up white because it's extreme. And then the top, only part of the X lights up because the other side's the backplate for the PCB. Let's talk about the tests we did, a quick methodology run through so you guys know what you're looking at. As always, please take our benchmarks with a grain of salt, just as you should any particular single benchmark list. Compare them with as many people as you can find running tests. Formulate your own opinion about whether or not the card's worth it for you, and do your due diligence. Don't listen to any one reviewer. We don't trust NVIDIA's number by themselves. We don't trust AMD's number by themselves. Don't trust our numbers by itself. Get as much information as you can. We added more titles. We threw out some old ones. You guys know I like to use a bunch of mixtures of engines, and that gives you a really good indication of what the performance is like. We use some synthetics. We use some live gameplays. We use time spy, superposition, and all that. But what we want to point out is we added a few titles in here now that actually use RTX technology, and those titles specifically being Metro Exodus. We also tested Shadow the Tomb Raider with the ray trace shadows, Battlefield 5 in here, which was one of the very first RTX titles. In fact, I think it was like the first RTX title that was public. And then of course we included Control, which is just, it's basically a playable benchmark if you want to know the truth. With all of the RTX technology available in there, it's got like 16 different dip switches basically for turning things up and down. But what's important to point out is that if it's an RTX title, with the exception of Control, we left them all on. If it's an RTX title, we tested it both RTX on, RTX off, showing you both the rasterization and the taxation of turning on RTX. So with all that out of the way, run through the benchmarks, pause them, and then, well, ascend into PCMR because this generation, this time around, is just the one that just keeps on giving. So now that you've seen those benchmark numbers, there's probably two things you didn't notice. So why don't you go ahead and go back and watch them again. And then maybe watch them one more time. And again, if you just really like the music, I don't know. There's a pattern. And that pattern really stuck out to me after about 10 hours of testing. And that's the fact that the 2080 Ti at 1080p was roughly the same FPS as the 3080 at 1440. Let that sink in. This is like a whole resolution tier higher at the same FPS on average than the 2080 Ti. It didn't always hold up, sometimes it was less, but it was close enough to where you wouldn't notice it. But speaking of FPS, none of these titles that featured DLSS had DLSS turned on. Native hardware ray tracing. Anyone right now that's on an RTX card or any card that features, I guess RTX card is what you need for ray tracing and DLSS, but if you've seen how good DLSS 2.0 is, and the amount of people that are like, DLSS 2.0 is amazing. We criticized DLSS when it first came out. For me, it was a smudgy mess. I didn't like it. And I just threw it aside and didn't bother with it again. My two 2080 Ti's at home don't have it turned on. I just was like, I don't like, it doesn't look good to me. But Phil was like, no, bro, you need to look at DLSS 2.0. And then he showed me Control, which is one of the titles that we have in here with DLSS 2.0 on. And it was absolutely insane how good it is. Speaking of insane, if I look at Control here, at 4K with the 3080 FE, he was getting 35 FPS. That's native ray tracing, no DLSS. Once we turn DLSS 2.0 on, which is 2.0 no matter what, that's the latest version, over 70 FPS, double the frame rate in Control. And I went, yeah, but is it all smudgy? Yeah, get off my lawn. Like I was a bitter old, yeah, it probably looks like crap. And I was just like, yeah. Wow, it looks so good. He was getting 100 FPS with the 3080 in 1080p ray tracing. Now 1080p, you can't really run DLSS with 1080p. So that's one of the reasons why we didn't turn on DLSS on these titles, because if you're running 1080p, it doesn't make any sense. The horsepower is too high. You actually have a performance hit if you turned on DLSS with a 1080p panel and a card running 1080p. But 1440p, 68 FPS hardware, he was getting over 120 FPS with DLSS 2.0 on, with ray tracing, in Control, all the functions turned on. Bruh. 2080 Ti and 2080, when it was launched in Gamescom in 2018, was a very controversial launch. A lot of people were very mad because we didn't see the typical 25 to 20 to 30, more like 20 to 22.5% uptick in performance or uplift in performance we're used to seeing generation on generation, because this was the first card of a new era of graphics cards, if you will. This is 2000 all over again with the GeForce 256. Rasterization! That's the way we're doing games now. And then I love that this is like the 5th time I pointed this out. All those articles from like AnonTech, PC Mag, and all of them, PC Gamer, they're all still public online. You can go and read the reviews of what people said about the way the old cards performed. The things everyone's like, oh no, we don't care about RTX, just leave it the way it was, is the same thing they said 20 years ago. Fast forward and it's the way we do games now. But what happened with the 20 series is like anything else, any new emerging tech, which now has RT cores and tensor cores and a whole new manufacturing process that's different than the way they were doing it. It's actually got worse yields in terms of wafer waste and such. It was expensive. So not only did it not conform to the typical $700-ish price of a 1080 Ti, it was $500 more than that, at $1,200. So it gave you like that, 40% more cost for like 20% more performance. That just was like, that doesn't make any sense. So people lost their minds, rightfully so. It just seemed like a move in the wrong direction in terms of pricing. The common thing you also heard people say was, just wait for the 2nd gen RTX cards. Behold, your savior, the 3080. This card is $400 less than a 2080 Ti, and it is up to 35 to 40% faster in some of our tests. I say some because no one test is indicative of how they all engines react differently in different architectures. It's got more RT cores, more tensor cores, faster memory, less of it, 10 gigs versus 11, but it's insane how they're able to get this much extra performance. And I found myself going, holy crap, 30% more at $400 less. My brain can't handle this. And then I dropped the real bombshell when I told Phil, I'm doing this wrong. You guys tell me that all the time. But I'm doing this wrong because I'm comparing it to a 2080 Ti. The story here is the way it compares to a 2080. That was an $800 card when it launched. That's an $800 card now. This is up to 90% faster at 0% more money. We have not seen that level of generational uptick from one generation to the next from NVIDIA ever. That's the story here. There was a chart going around, we showed it in our previous video on Reddit, where somebody actually did like the performance uplift of one generation to the next, and it's like, and then literally Ampere is just like off the top of the chart. Well, it didn't hit the top of the chart, but it showed just how absolutely ridiculous that one generation jump was. Typically, they'll go back, you know, a couple generations because they believe most people will update on that like 2-year cycle, or that 2-generation cycle, excuse me. So it's up to 4 to 5 years, to 90% more performance at 0% extra cost, price for price. So there's multiple ways you can look at this. You can be like, oh, okay, you know, top tier versus top tier. Well, this isn't top tier. 3090 is top tier. That one won't have quite the Cinderella story, I guess, because that's $700 more than this one. And you're not going to get $700 more performance, which is, you know, nearly double the cost. That's just the, you want the best, it has an exponential cost associated with it. And that's fine. I will be running 3090 in my system. I'm fairly certain I'm going to buy the card because I don't believe we're being seeded any 3090 FE cards. And I really, really like the way the 3090 FE looks. And I want to build a system around it. I'm going to be a customer just like you buying it. So there's some other things to talk about here though. The pattern that I said earlier is that 1440p FPS on the 3080 is like roughly the same as 1080p performance on the 2080 Ti. It was weird, which really made me go, wait a minute, that's with an important asterisk on all these charts, is that the 2080 Ti saw a massive improvement when we did our benchmarking, and I went, what is going on here? So I've got my benchmark spreadsheets here, and I've got tabs for all the games we do, and I've got every card we've ever tested, formulations and stuff, my cost of performance and uplift, drivers that we've used, and all that sort of stuff. Because one of the things we look for is like, did we see any reduction in performance with a certain driver on a certain card? There's that whole like, planned obsolescence, NVIDIA slows down your cards to try and make you buy new ones. That's bullshit. They've never done that. Linus has talked about it, I've talked about it, Gamers Next talked about it. We've all proven, if anything, we see a performance increase over time in the generations and the maturity of the drivers. But this one I couldn't explain because I was seeing big improvements, like 20 FPS improvements in like 1080p on the 2080 Ti. So I spent a while trying to figure that one out, and then it dawned on me. When the 2080 Ti came out and we benchmarked it, it was on my 8th gen 8700K system. And the benchmarks for this launch were re-performed, because when it's that old, we always re-perform the benchmarks, because like I said, things change. We saw a major uplift by going to the 10900K, which tells us at 1080p, the 2080 Ti, if you're on an 8700K or something around that era or older, you could potentially be bottlenecking yourself pretty strongly in that, like I said, we saw up to 20 FPS improvement on some titles, which is insane. So that major gap between these two is with that uplift accounted for. Otherwise, you can't have a 10900K at launch and then, you know, I could have been like, here are the numbers at launch versus numbers at launch, but that wouldn't be indicative of real life performance because the performance available today with that card and the CPUs, and if you had upgraded, would have been the same improvement. So it actually brought the two cards closer together, but it's still an amazing gap there. So then I went, okay, if you're on a 2080 Ti and you're selling it to get a 3080 and you're on like a 8700K, are you gonna further bottleneck yourself? Phil and I talked about this, and I wasn't sure whether or not I should recommend that you go out and buy a new CPU and motherboard. Depending on how old your system is, I might recommend that. If you're on like a 4770K or a 4790K, like a Devil's Canyon or something, yes, it's time to upgrade, because putting a 3080 on that, that's even, unless you're running 4K, even at 1440p, you're gonna see bottlenecking. It's insane how fast this card is. But what we felt was probably the more cost-effective and beneficial upgrade is actually to your panel. Yes, 1080p is still the dominant resolution on the Steam statistics, you know, system stats, whatever they call it. So unless you're an esports gamer that needs like the 360 FPS, like the new panels and stuff from NVIDIA that feature reflex technology, doing things like StarCraft, League of Legends, CSGO, Valorant, Rocket League, Overwatch. Bottom line is, unless you're an esports gamer that needs that ultra fast FPS, you'd be running a fast enough CPU anyway, so it'd probably be more of a moot point. But it'd be more beneficial, honestly, if you're running that old 1080p from 2010 to go, you know what? Go buy yourself a $300 1440p high refresh rate panel.
With the money that you saved.
With the money that you saved, yeah. Absolutely. With the money that you save with a 3080 versus a 2080 Ti, that $400 is enough to buy a high-end CPU. We feel like the beneficial upgrade would actually be to your panel. You'll get a much nicer looking image, you'll get more modern tech, you'll get the full horsepower, which means you can keep your older CPU because you're offloading more of that load to the GPU. Speaking of load, let's talk temperatures, because that's the other thing. The real story is, how hot does that get? The cooler on this 2080 Ti has a backplate, has heat pads, it touches things, and holy crap, does it get hot? So immediately people's concerns because of the heat of this guy is, what's this gonna do for your CPU cooler if you've got this fan right here pulling air through, well, that way, and blowing it up into the CPU cooler area? What's that gonna do for your temperatures? Surely that's gonna heat up your CPU. The air that comes through here is warmish. Yeah, I said it, warmish. It's not hot enough to heat up your CPU, period. Now I know other YouTubers are probably already talking about that in their review today. We're gonna do a separate video on that because the problem is our test bed is actually a water-cooled system. So we don't have a CPU tower sucking air through it. But I can tell you the air that's coming through there is no warmer than the air you would feel coming through your AIO. And if that were the case, no one would ever mount a front-mounted AIO because it would just heat up your system and make it far too hot. In fact, I have a video about that even. More than one of those videos showing a front-mounted AIO on your system does not hurt your system whatsoever. Fight me, bro. It doesn't hurt your system. Neither will this, because even at the factory fan curve, which runs dead silent, the amount of air moving through it is enough to cool the GPU, but it's not enough to cause a massive heat bubble above it. It just dissipates into the air, and you have to like get your hand real close to it to start to feel any of that warmth. And once I sped up the fan curve and used a user-defined fan curve where it was sitting more or less like 52% instead of 40% under load, you can feel the air coming through, and it's just a little bit warmer than ambient. Not enough to hurt anything in your system. In fact, I would much rather have slightly warm air blowing on my RAM than no air at all if you're running an AIO. If anything, I feel like this could help your system. So we're gonna do full testing on that. But as for the core, with the stock fan curve, on our open air test bench, mind you, people always like to fight us on that. We don't want to put it in a case and have the case determine what our temperatures are, because there's no case out there that's going to match everyone's use case, which means that no matter what, the results will not be indicative of your experience. So we open air test bench, so the only thing limiting the core's temperature is the cooler itself. Don't make me have to keep repeating it. It doesn't take rocket surgery to understand this, okay? If you're not understanding what I'm saying, then maybe we just can't be friends. If the cooler is the only thing affecting the temperatures, that tells us how good the cooler does. If I took the same card and threw it in that case that Steve did a review of with like the 15 fans that blow into nothing, of course the cooler is gonna look like it sucks. So we don't want that to affect it. With that rant out of the way, with the stock fan curve, we never saw it get any higher than 72 Celsius. Under hours and hours of testing. Today, that card, well, yesterday it saw a solid 6 hours of runtime before we switched to other cards. And then today it saw another solid 2.5 hours of runtime without a break. Because we want to get the card nice and heat soaked. We don't want to have a cold card start a benchmark and then look real good at the beginning and then drop. We heat the card up, then we run our test. 72C. And when I put the fan curve to the factory or the user-defined fan curve, you go into Afterburner, you click fan, there's a button you click, it brings out a drop down, you can set the fan curve. I just click default user-defined, which has a nice ramp to it. 61C. The AIBs have their work cut out for them. Because the saving grace for them on this card was that it looks pretty, but the flow is terrible. In my opinion, this looks great, and it has the flow to go with it. So with that out of the way, I just have one question. How the hell did they do it?